So our speaker today, Amy Vedra, is the Director of Reference Services at the Indiana Historical Society. So she was born and raised in Griffith, Indiana, in the northwest corner of the state. Amy graduated with a bachelor's degree in history from Purdue University, which that particular Purdue is now Purdue Northwest, for those in the know. She moved to Indianapolis to pursue her graduate studies at Indiana University-Purdue, Indianapolis. So she has her master's degrees in history and library science, and she has been with the Indiana Historical Society since 2005. So she's a really awesome presenter, great researcher, and I'm really excited for her to talk a little bit about leaving the farm.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be with you today here to discuss leaving the farm, town and city living. As Elizabeth said, I am born and raised in Indiana, and I'm really excited about this program because I get to talk about something I'm really passionate about as far as doing various types of research to support family history, but also I get to focus on my home area in the state of Indiana. Those of you from Indiana may recognize the term region or Calumet region in regards to Northwest Indiana, and that is where I grew up. And having moved to Indianapolis 20 plus years ago, it's not something that I get to talk about very much when I present. So I would like to note I have done this kind of neighborhood and lifestyle build out a few times. But this is the first time, or this is the first program in which I do so using my home area in Northwest Indiana. This talk will focus on two families as they transition to town and city living from more rural areas. I may stray a bit from actual farm families, but I will relay information on those moving from more rural areas to industrial places and how to build the world around them in their new home. Certainly living in a rural area differs heavily from living in a town or city, even today. Access to goods is generally very different, and this program makes me think about the ways that things are now in comparison to the way they were 90 plus years ago. Researchers looking back to today will have lots of different things to consider. They'll have to consider in cities and towns food deserts and lack of public transportation in some areas and a dearth of other services, not just in rural places, but in cities and towns. But first, we have to start somewhere. So the first thing you need to do is identify the person you want to track through history. This is something we're all familiar with as people interested in family history. Ideally, this will be someone you've already researched or for whom you have some basic family information. For my own relatives, I had some of that basic information, partly because I was lucky enough to know 3 of my great-grandmothers, the last of whom died when I was in my 20s. I had all 4 of my grandparents until I was 30, and this has given me a lot of information about past family members when people weren't being too tight-lipped about it, that is. Of course, I understand that not everybody is as lucky and as blessed as I was. For the In-Zellous family, I had to start from square one, working backwards actually to learn about them. The In-Zellous family I plucked out of the census for Gary in 1930 and worked backwards to figure out information and forwards in some cases. So with William In-Zellous, represented here by the 1930 census on the screen, living in Gary with his wife Fanny, he was born the son of a farmer in Auburn, Lee County, Alabama. He made his way to Indiana shortly after World War I. And unfortunately, I do not have any photographs of William In-Zellous, but that does not detract from my ability to help build his family information and community life. I also want to point out that in the case of the In-Zellouses, we must think about segregation being very prominent at this time in Indiana. He came to Indiana about 1919, and there would have been a lot of segregation and discrimination in Indiana at that time. So this would have been also something to consider, would be that the Black populations of Gary during the time that the Great Migration was occurring were moving into Gary in the same areas that the immigrant families were moving into. And so this also influenced the neighborhoods in which they lived. The photograph on the left is a wedding photo of my great-grandmother, Veronica Dorothy Sabol, with her groom, John Joseph Jadmak. dressed for their wedding on June 12, 1928. I am going to focus on Veronica through time during this presentation, but I will also throw in a bit about her father, Stephen, and husband, John, when needed. Veronica was the daughter of an immigrant who first worked as a coal miner in Braceville, Illinois, before moving his family to Northwest Indiana. More specifically, this was eventually to the Robertsdale area of Hammond, often focused on Whiting, Indiana events and organizations due to ethnicity. But we'll talk about more about this later. Before I really delve into these two examples, though, I want to discuss the types of resources that I find extremely useful when building out a person or family's life in a specific city or town. So we're all familiar with the standards. If you've been doing genealogy for any length of time, if you've ever used Ancestry, you're familiar with census records, with birth records, with death records, marriage records, and then of course, family kept records. Family kept records can sometimes fill in those gaps that you don't find in some of those other types of records. Think Bible, name lists and such. But some of us are not lucky enough to have those robust family kept records. So those listed here, as far as what I consider the standard records, are not the only records that come into play, but they are probably the most well-known, easiest accessed, or first thought of when doing basic genealogy or family history, date-based research. Other records might include church records, particularly helpful if your family has long been participating in the same faith, and you can point to specific churches they attended. Additional records can also serve these purposes, but for now, we're going to start discussing the records we came together to analyze today. There are so many records that can help us to learn about the lives of our ancestors. And since I'm following two of these families through the early 20th century, we're going to talk about some of the beyond standard records that we have. So beyond the standards, this list presented here is just the tip of the iceberg, much like the standard resources are, that could further information or inform you about your family history. But these are some of my favorites. With city directories and city and regional directories, I will admit that someone once asked me what my favorite, what my historical crush was. And I asked if it could be an inanimate object because I really love city directories. Purely from a historical perspective. If you aren't familiar with city directories, but you've spent time entering family names in Ancestry, you've probably seen city directory listings of the names you were searching. While I love that the alphabetical listings sometimes include the occupation, the name of the spouse, the first name of the widow's deceased husband, in addition to the address, for the majority of the 20th century, the Polk City Directories, one of the most popular publishers of directories, included a cross-reference directory. This allows you to look at the address and see who and what was nearby in the area. Though the directories I used for my research today were mostly sourced through Ancestry, many local libraries have directory collections. And those of you on this presentation today have probably used some of them for your own research. In addition to directories, and though I didn't have an opportunity to use them in this particular presentation, city, county, and church histories are very important in a lot of historical research. So city and church histories are fewer and further between than the county histories, though I do encourage those looking and researching a specific area or denomination to search for their family names and search for these types of histories in those areas. County histories, at least in Indiana, were mostly written from the 1880s through the 1910s. It is also good to note that those groups that have been historically excluded from the narrative in general will be more difficult to find in these types of resources. When researching, don't forget to look for digitized versions of early county histories online, many thanks to ACPL and their work with digitization firms that have provided those online. Also, checking ACPL, your local library, or the library local to the area you're researching would likely provide further books for your review, especially those that are still currently in copyright. One of my favorite resources beyond city directories is maps. Maps are often created to show how to get from one place or another, while other maps help one understand a place, but that does not have to be their only use. Maps can be general or specific, and many doing genealogy research or family history research have likely used a county history atlas to look at a snapshot of landowners at a specific moment in time. Those maps can be incredibly helpful and typically include the needed notations to figure out the location of your relative's parcel when you've encountered a land purchase or ownership document. Even if the atlas doesn't include their name because it is from a different era, you're typically able to use the atlas to and the coordinates that you have to figure out where in the county your family member lived. Other maps can provide a look at transportation means in the area your relative lived. Maps for cities and towns often include important landmarks, and these could include recreation areas, cemeteries, large businesses, and more. Maps used in conjunction with other resources can help paint a picture of life in the area. If you've been working on your family history for any length of time, you've probably had the pleasure of using newspaper microfilm, which isn't exactly the easiest way to track down family history information. Certainly, it can be easy to go to a specific date or month in the newspaper to find a marriage listing, a birth or death notice, but there is so much more that we can find in newspapers. However, how do you scour microfilm for a 3-line society blurb on your family throughout time? How about a brief mention of a court filing or a housing or land transfer? It's nearly impossible unless you have an unlimited supply of time, fortitude, amazing eyesight, and a strong back. With more and more newspapers becoming available digitally through databases, whether free or paid, we are finding ever-increasing insight into those small moments in our ancestors' lives. The information we learn helps us to build the picture we can't know having not known them at that time in their life. Did your family member play in the local baseball league? Did they host club meetings at their home? Were they the founding member of an organization? So much can be learned from these seeming insignificant news and notes. The last one I'm going to specifically speak about today, but certainly not the last available resource that is out there, are employee newsletters and company records. These may be a resource that is a little bit more difficult to track down. While some employee newsletters may be lost to the ages, others may be in the hands of corporate archives, institutions like the Indiana Historical Society, the Indiana State Library, or local libraries. These were not typically meant to stand the test of time, but rather to be an informative piece that was read and discarded by the employees. Employee newsletters tend to be a wealth of information on a group that can sometimes be excluded from the larger scale document series. When you are talking about an employee newsletter for an industrial business, you hope to find a lot about those in the working class. Working class individuals are not always at the forefront of news and society columns, so these types of resources offer a peek into those lives. As I said, this is certainly not the end-all, be-all, never-ending list of possible sources for the type of research I am talking about today. Other resources can certainly be helpful as well, and you will develop a list of helpful resources for yourself as you work towards research for your own family. Before we move on to more specific notes on the people I am following through time today, I do have one last thing to mention. You may not have luck finding your ancestor in these types of historical records. Does that mean you can't learn about your ancestors through them? I would say absolutely not. It might mean that you will need to spend more time seeking information on those in the professions in the same geographic area of a similar age or ethnic or racial background to try and understand what your family member was like and what they would have been going through. What I am discussing today is building a narrative where one has not existed for your family yet. That does not always mean finding records specific to your family, but helping to expand your research with likelihoods. Rest assured, you are not making up your family history. You are working to understand your ancestors' lives in the only way that you can. Now I will be following the In-Zellous and Sabol Jadmak families across time. Let's see what I found out. So, the In-Zellous family, we're going to focus on them first. The Zellous family is an interesting case because, as I said, this was a family that I knew nothing about. And I've been able to piece together quite a bit of information about them just from the few resources that I was able to find that spoke about them, that spoke about the areas in which they lived, and things to that of that nature. So William Zellous, as previously noted, was the son of a farmer. He would have perhaps seen scenes such as these on the screen while living in Auburn, Alabama. His family lived on a rural route outside of town. In doing some research on this family during and before the Great Migration, there were certain questions I could not answer. However, family members may be able to do so using family lore, family stories, or records that they have in their own holdings. I did find myself wondering if his family background include enslaved or free peoples in the South. I will note that the family-tied surnames or variations thereof do appear in the form of slave owner names in the 1850 and 1860 slave census schedules in that area. I would have liked to explore this part of the Zellous history more, but as I am focusing on his move to Northwest Indiana, that will need to be an exploration for another time. Auburn itself is known for its university by the same name. It's the largest land-grant university in Alabama. The change of scenery for him would have been drastic when leaving his rural life behind. It is unclear when he left Auburn. However, we know that he served in World War I right after or just before he moved to Northwest Indiana. Let's explore that aspect of William's life for a moment, as that would have had a major impact on him as well. So when William Zellous left his life behind, his rural life behind, he either went directly to or very shortly thereafter ended up in the military serving in World War I. Records show that William Zellous was in Northwest Indiana by 1919 when he married his first wife and shortly after he returned from World War I. However, the regiment he was in during World War I, the 809th Pioneer Infantry, showed that most of the members were from the Middle and Northwest. So that's, again, makes it unclear as to where he was living at the time that he joined the military. It is possible that he had already moved north by the time he was drafted, but some interesting points about his World War I service. Zellous listed his father on his Army documentation, which would have been his closest relative, and his rural free delivery route number as the address to which information should be sent to William Sr. I have never researched or heard of the Pioneer Infantry regiments in which Zellous served prior to working on this presentation. With the help of a genealogy website, I found reference to a book about these regiments written by Margaret M. McMahon. That site noted that the Pioneer Infantry were similar to regular Army troops in that they were trained in infantry tactics, but they were also trained in combat engineering. 20 of the 37 Pioneer Infantry regiments were filled with African American soldiers. Pioneers infantry regiments were formed during the World War I era to serve as road maintenance troop, but were often used as labor for anything that needed to be accomplished. In addition, I found information in a book from the time that noted much information on the Black troops overseas in World War I. The book, titled Two Colored Women with the American Expeditionary Forces, includes a chapter on these pioneer infantries. Notes on Zellous's regiment included the following. The regiments were often called the Eights. They arrived in France in early October and almost immediately were ordered to the front. Investigation showed that this regiment, the 809th Pioneer Infantry, had been formed out of about the 1st of September, sailed the 21st of the same month, and that most of the men knew very little about handling a rifle. The order was revoked to go to the front, and the regiment kept in the rear, most of them being sent to Nantes, France, where they remained until the following summer. And yet this regiment had a larger percentage of professional and skilled men and skilled artisans in their ranks than most of the others. When I was doing research about William Zellous, one of the most amazing images that I found was the image at the bottom of your screen right now. This particular image is at Saint-Nazaire, France, as the USS Sierra was departing to bring the men home from World War I. This was the boat, this was the moment that William Zellous was sailing home on July 13th, 1919, with other troops from his regiment and others on board. The image perspective appears to be from the ship. The USS Sierra would arrive in Brooklyn on July 23rd, 1919, with the soldiers heading to Camp Mills in Long Island to be processed out of service. As stated before, we know that shortly after William Zellous left the military, he was definitely in Northwest Indiana. His future first wife, Fanny Morgan, was already living in Gary, Indiana with her parents at the time. Clem and Amy Morgan, Amy sometimes listed as Annie, moved to Gary, Indiana sometime before 1918 from Auburn, Lee County, Alabama. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? I find it highly likely that the Morgan and Zellous families were familiar with one another in Auburn. Questions linger in my mind, being unclear as to whether William migrated to Gary specifically for Fanny, or if he did so because he knew the Morgan family and felt comfortable heading somewhere that not everyone was a stranger. While answering my questions may not be all but impossible, there are some things we do know. William Zellous returned from World War I in late July 1919, and by late September that same year, he was married to Fanny Morgan in Indiana. In the 1920 city directory for Gary, Indiana, we can see that William is listed as a laborer. Though Fanny had worked as a dishwasher while living with her parents, according to the 1918 Gary city directory, she no longer shows an occupation in the directory or the census of 1920. We won't see an occupation listed for her again until the late 1940s. Though I spend most of my time following William, I think that Fanny's life is equally interesting. Some of the records speak to them both, while others speak to just one of the members of the couple. One of the best ways to look at what someone's life was like over time in a given area is to look through as many city directories as you can find. In doing so, in the Gary city directories for the Zellous family, I found out some interesting tidbits. The family was alternately listed and not listed in some years, with the same address listed over a period of 4 years, in which 1 year in the middle, they were not listed at all. It's difficult to know why this might have happened. It could have been that their update card got lost in the mail, or they weren't home when the compiler was coming through. It's not a big deal because they may have still been listed in the cross-reference directory. In this case, they were not, but it appears the building had multiple residences. So that could have led to the discrepancy and them being left out for 1 year. I will note, because of the 1930 census, I know the family still resided on Jackson Street in Gary then, but they quickly disappeared from the directory for the entirety of the 1930s. When they reappeared, it was first only Fanny Zellous. Having followed William Zellous through the census years first, I knew from the 1940 census that William appeared with a different woman, Thelma, in the 1940 census in East Chicago. At that time, I did not seek out Fanny in the census, so I wasn't sure if she had passed away or if they had been divorced. But the answer to that question came later, and clearly, though, this was partially answered when she appeared in the 1941 city directory in Gary again. It wasn't until the 1945 directory that we see the return of William with his wife Thelma to Gary. At that point, they purchased a home at 2364 Delaware Street. Thelma did not work. However, William worked as a janitor for Simon Brothers Jewelers on Broadway in Gary, before later being listed as a construction worker. The last readily available year of the directory was the 1958-1959 volume. At that time, Zellous was listed as a construction worker for Inland Steel in East Chicago. I have to admit, it makes me wonder if he had started work with them in 1952 when he was first listed as being a construction worker. But it wasn't listed by business because they were outside of Gary. Not sure I'll be able to answer that question, but I think it's a pretty good guess. Fanny Zellous's occupations were listed starting in 1941 at Carnegie Illinois Steel. Later, her position was listed as being at U.S. Steel, but that was the same entity, as it had merged. Indiana Steel had merged with Illinois Steel to become to become U.S. SEAL. Apologies. The last directory year did not list an occupation for her. Even after she and William split, she was forever known as Mrs. Fanny In-Zellous in the directories that I found. I did not find record of her remarrying, and we'll talk about more on this later. One thing that I love to do with maps when I'm talking and following a family through a specific period of time is to plot what their neighborhood would have looked like on a map. In this instance, I took a 1940s Sanborn fire insurance map, the main map that gave me a good view of Gary, Indiana, so that I could really plot out different things that were available to them and where they lived. So the green dots represent where William In-Zellous resided and where he worked. You can see that with Gary, we only had a couple of workplaces for both William and Fanny. So the dark green dot on the small map to the right is the map that includes where the Zellouses worked. Now this was after they had divorced. One of the residences that you see on the map, the topmost residence, was the residence that William and Fanny shared before they moved out to East Chicago. The residences, and they would have also shared one of the residences on the south of the railroad tracks as well. But the residence near number 83 is the residence that William shared with his wife, Thelma. The residents marked in yellow are the residences in which Fanny lived on her own. And the one just off of Jefferson is the one she lived in the longest. Pink dots represent churches and schools, which speak to the nature of the area. And then purple are gas and grocery stores. So that might have been where they needed to shop or stop to fill their car with gas. So I find it really interesting to try and understand a family's neighborhood based solely on the places that they're visiting, places that they have available to them. As previously mentioned, without having as much in-depth information on the In-Zellous family, their lives are a bit more difficult to piece together. But I can work toward doing so nonetheless. Newspapers come into play as a particularly useful source when trying to piece together someone's lives. One of the earliest newspaper articles I found was a listing of businesses and organizations which were filing their incorporation papers with the Secretary of State. This was found in the Indianapolis Star. William In-Zellous was listed as one of the incorporators along with 8 other African-American gentlemen from the Gary area. Though I was unable to find more information about the Gary Working Men's Club, they listed that they planned to hold conferences in addition to their business and religious meetings. No denomination is ever listed, but we don't have any extra clues for the In-Zellous' religious beliefs, but it does seem to indicate that there was some religious tie for them in the community. At the time of this listing, In-Zellous was married to Fanny and would be for another 6 or 7 years. I noted earlier that I had wondered what happened to Fanny and William's relationship. And though there are still questions left by the records I found, some of those answers were gained through the couple of sources. In May of 1936, legal cases filed in the Gary Superior Court included a divorce proceeding for William In-Zellous and Fanny In-Zellous. It is unclear what led to the divorce, but I can say that William married Maggie Thelma Williams, most often known as Thelma in the records, in July of the same year. So in May of 36, they filed for divorce, and in July of that year, William married Thelma. Finally, it can also be difficult to discuss racial disparities across time, and those that are still occurring today. But the final piece I have included with the In-Zellous family and how they would have lived their lives is a look at the directory from the collection of the Indiana Historical Society. This is the 1947-1948 Indiana Negro Business and Professional Pictorial Guide. It was put together by a publishing firm in Gary. This directory told members of the Black community throughout Indiana where they would be able to patronize Black businesses and also likely find a good reception for doing business in their communities. Finally, with life comes death, and I wanted to mention different things found when seeking death information for these members of the In-Zellous family. I have here a few of the standard genealogy resources represented. We have a death record out of Cook County, Illinois for William In-Zellous. He died in May of 1979. His first wife, Fanny, died just a few months later in August that same year. Interestingly, though I found no record of Fanny remarrying, she is listed as a widow in her death record. It begs the question as to whether I missed something in my research, if she considered herself to be married to William for life despite the divorce, or if the informant wasn't fully familiar with Fanny and just knew her as Mrs. In-Zellous and made an assumption. Thelma, officially Maggie Thelma In-Zellous, passed on about a year and a half after William in October of 1980. She and William had continued to live in the same residence they took up back in 1945. I uncovered evidence about their ownership of their home in the August of 1985 newspaper. Notice this is 5 years after Thelma passed. That list, the Zellouses were listed among the delinquent tax list for the property taxes in the Gary area. Obviously, they couldn't be paying their taxes since they had passed away, but it appears that no one had been able to take over their home. When I first started researching this collection and this group of materials, the 1950 census was not out yet. The last thing that I looked at was the 1950 census, and the In-Zellouses are listed as a family in their home in Gary, Indiana, but they are also listed as having a 13-year-old son. I will say that is the first time that I've ever seen a notation about a child born of their union or a child as part of their union. And I've never found, I was unable to find any other resources that noted a child in their relationship. Thelma's death record, her certificate informant was her niece. So it is clear that they did still have relatives in the area, whether their son was still in the area or not, or if something had happened to him. This does add a sad note in that this is the way I found out about what happened to them and the end of their lives and the end of their home. I know there is more to find though, and I would love to continue researching this family's story. Next, I want to focus on a different family and a different way of looking at something. And I'm lucky enough, like I said earlier, to have some great information in my family that I've been able to collect. The person that I'm researching today, her daughters are both still alive. And so there's information that I can still gain from family members. And so it really is a wonderful thing to be able to still talk to people who know about some of this story. I will note that I've now found some parts of the story that the daughters were not familiar with and didn't know. So you never know what you're going to find out. And even though you know someone who is alive, who knew these people that you're researching, it doesn't mean they knew all of the things that we can find out in our resources. Veronica Sabol was born in Braceville, Illinois in 1900. Though this area wasn't particularly known for its farmland, there were farmers in the area. However, the bulk of the immigrant residents to this area worked as coal miners. This was a particularly harsh and dangerous job, and still is today, really. During its heyday, around 1888, Braceville was a veritable metropolis in comparison to other coal mining towns. They included many shops, fraternal organization, 2 banks, a hotel, and an opera house. I highly doubt the Sabols were able to afford the advantages of the town on any grand scale. And I know from the census that they lived outside of town, probably on a rural free delivery route like the In-Zellouses had. It is unknown whether they spent much time in town or grew their own food or used a company store or any of those questions that I would have about their life in Braceville. There is so much more I can learn about Braceville, though, and the coal mining industry there. There was a great website by the Coal City Public Library District that told me about the area and the conditions. I also reached out to the Coal City Public Library District about using the 2 photographs on the left. The librarian who responded even offered to do a cursory search for my family's name in their holdings. Though that search was not fruitful, it shows the willingness out there to assist in building this larger narrative for our families. In my family, we are lucky to have a photograph of their Braceville home in our family collection. It is unclear to us who is pictured, but it is possible that the young woman standing by the door is my great-grandmother in her early teen years. Let this be a lesson to you. Asking your living relatives to provide information on old photographs can be very important. After receiving this image, I asked my mom if she knew who the people in the photograph were. She didn't see anyone other than the girl by the door. But do you see the children behind the corn just to her left? I really wish that this picture was more clear so that I could see more about those children that are standing just to the side of the door. It is often difficult to determine when someone arrived in a specific geographic area. I know we've all struggled with that in the past. Various resources state conflicting information, whether it's immigration dates from the census, information in county or city histories, family stories, or other information located by the researcher, such as the detailed information shown here in my great-great-grandfather's obituary. Though we don't have specific dates, the obituary helps to narrow down approximately when he and likely his entire family, including my great-grandmother Veronica, moved from one area to the other, from Braceville to Northwest Indiana. It appears he moved to the United States from Austria-Hungary as a Slovak around 1888. Of course, that speaks to what the European makeup was at the time that he moved. This coincides with the notation on the 1930 census of 1887. And given the apparent accuracy of this, does that mean I should trust other parts of the statement, which indicates that he would have arrived in Northwest Indiana around 1902? That's hard to say, because it also says that he's been a watchman at American Maize Company, better known as Amazo, for 20 years. But that is not what the city directories tell me. Between 1919 and 1939, he was reported as a laborer, cooper, mill worker, foreman, and finally in the 1929 directory as a watchman. Perhaps he spent the last 10 years of his career at Amazo as a watchman, but labored in other odd jobs there for the 10 years prior to that. In any case, though a fantastic resource, newspaper reports are not always complete or correct. As with lots of other genealogy records, getting correct corroboration when you can be really important. You'll notice on the right that I have a postcard stating greetings from Robertsdale, Hammond, Indiana. I will say postcards can be a really interesting way to pick up and view a part of what the area looked like, where your family was from and where they lived. So I do encourage research in postcards and looking at postcards from various towns and cities around the country that you're researching for your family, because you might be able to picture better the lives in which they lived. So with the Sabols, they're a bit more difficult to follow due to their geographic location. Though they were in Robertsdale for much of the time, the Hammond directories were readily available, similar to those of the Gary directories. But because the Sabol family moved around a little bit more between 1902 and 1921, they proved more difficult to track down. Whiting did not have directories of their own, but sometimes were enumerated in the Hammond directories. Also, as previously mentioned, the Sabols residing in Robertsdale starting in the early 1920s made it easy to find them in the Hammond directories, but that area had strong ties to Whiting, so much so that, as you can see here, I have noted that their post office was the Whiting post office when they lived in that part of the city of Hammond. I would also like to point out that their home address went through something many cities and towns of various sizes experienced: renumbering addresses. Between 1928 and 1929, the area was renumbered and the name of their street was altered. This means that starting in 1929, their home address is 902 address numbers away from their previous numerical address. And instead of West Park being their street name, it is now West Park. Luckily, the directory made note of the change as it had just occurred. Often directories and Sanborn fire insurance maps do this to aid those of the time to gain quick access to the new street addresses. I do always personally wonder how this affected mail delivery for that time while the post office was trying to figure out how that all transitioned. But that's a question for another day. These directories also helped me in following the work that the Sabol and Jadmak families did. Stephen, as we saw in the previously highlighted obituary, worked at the end of his life as a watchman for a Mazo. When first coming to Northwest Indiana, he was a saloon owner and worked in real estate. According to my mother, my great-grandmother Veronica had only a 3rd grade education. However, it wasn't until she was in her early 20s that she is listed separately in directories listing her various jobs at Standard Oil Company. Finally, I went into the Gary City directories to find her and John Jadmak after they married in 1928. Veronica no longer had an occupation listed once she was married, much like In-Zellous. John was an entrepreneur and a variety of jobs were listed, including 2 different billiard parlors, of which he was the proprietor, before taking jobs as a foreman for the City Board of Commissioners, and lastly as a maintenance man for Standard Steel Spring. The family disappears from Gary directories in the early 1930s, moving to Valparaiso and Porter County before they returned to Gary in the mid-1930s, staying about a decade longer at the same residence. After that time, the family is no longer listed in the directory, but I know the family moved to Calumet Township, an area that at a much later date was annexed by the city of Gary, but not listed in the directories until much later. Much like I did with the Zellouses, I was also able to mark out the life for the Jadmaks. And what I will note is that I know from my family stories and from family information that I have that their daughters and their family attended one specific church and they attended one specific school. So the specific churches and schools that I have listed here with the pink dots are these schools and church that that family absolutely attended. I can also say that the address on West 13th Street, just under the 65, is the home that they lived in from the time they moved back to Gary in the mid-1930s until they left that part of Gary in the 1940s. Now, it's much more difficult to determine which of the gas and grocery stores they would have gone to, but you can certainly see there were a variety of places that they could have shopped. Things that I'm aware of, also that I'll be talking about here in the next slide or two, also speak to maybe where they would have gone. Now that we've seen what we can do with that information by plotting it on maps and really understanding more about where things were in proximity to their homes, their places of work, we can look a little more in depth into what our ancestors' lives were like through visiting other sources. I was very lucky to find evidence of my great-grandmother's work at Standard Oil in their employee newsletter. In December 1919, the women workers were highlighted in an amazing photographs shown here. As you can see, Veronica's family name was misspelled, but my grandmother, upon seeing this image, immediately picked out her mother, confirming it was simply that, a misspelling. Seeing her in greasy coveralls was a quick difference to the prim and proper woman I met before she died when I was 5. This picture was a revelation to my family, including her daughter, my grandmother, as we had always known that she worked in the candle department, but didn't know that she had worked in other parts of the company prior to that. I know my great-grandmother didn't learn to drive until she was widowed in the late 1950s. This led me to questions about how she would have navigated Hammond, Whiting, and eventually her new homes in Gary and then Valparaiso and back to Gary. As I mentioned, plotting out the different places that she could have gone to nearest to their home would have been important. But she most likely also had to utilize public transport for at least some of her errands. My great-grandfather would have often been working and unable to take her where she needed to go. Keep in mind that she had 2 young girls by the mid-1930s, so this would have been an interesting task for sure. But she may have been able to use something like the Gary Railways to get to work when she was living in Whiting, to get different places when she was in Gary. Finally, though I haven't touched on it much, my maternal great-grandparents were both children of Slovak immigrants, first-generation Americans. They likely met at a Slovak organization dance or other social setting of a similar type. Both Gary and Whiting had booming Slovak clubs, and both families were heavily involved in those at the time. This ties in with the cookbook shown here, but also with several other pieces I located in newspapers. My great-grandfather, John Jack Jadmak, was the president of the Gary Athletic Club in the early 1930s and also worked with the Catholic Slovak Athletic Association. It appears he and his brother both played baseball for the Slovak team in Gary at one time. As seen in other newspapers, my great-great-grandfather, Stephen Sabol, was one of the directors of the Slovak Home Association at the time of his death and involved in several other Slovak organizations, most notably the First Catholic Slovak Union of America, in which he had served as a supreme officer at one time. This cookbook was created by the First Catholic Slovak Ladies Association, an organization that I personally have ties to as well. This edition pictured is my mother's, received from her grandmother Veronica as a wedding present. Though difficult to see, it is well loved, a bit tattered, and holds some of my family's treasured recipes. Our Slovak family heritage is still important to us, making this illustration poignant in my family's continued history. I'm lucky to have a copy of the newest edition of this cookbook from my mother, and look forward to cooking the banana bread and barbecue beef on bun recipes that our family enjoy. I'm sure you noticed those recipes that I just mentioned didn't exactly sound Slovak. And they aren't, but they are interpretations of American recipes by Slovak ladies of the day. The Slovak recipes I cook, most often cabbage and noodles, cabbage rolls, are firmly stuck in my brain and no need to use a recipe. Though we've seen it before, I think it's important to bring back the newspaper article from Stephen Sabol's death. This is one of the best death notices that I've come across for one of my own family members. The depth of information included with the various organizations he was active in, the brief history of his coming to America, and finally to Northwest Indiana, provide a richness I would not have had without this listing. With all of the organizations he belonged to, especially, I have further leads to trace about my family and the activities in which they were involved. I look forward to trying to track down some of these records and learn more about my Slovak heritage. Through family lore, I was already aware of the tragic death of my great-grandfather. As noted in the death notice here, my great-grandfather had heard a crash occur down the road from his home. Upon trying to investigate, he was hit by a vehicle and killed. Other newspaper accounts go into more detail of the accident, but I don't know what happened to the driver of the vehicle who ended my grandfather's life. I don't even know much more about the circumstances other than the person was driving too fast in the area. I may eventually look to court records to try and close this chapter in our family history. Finally, my great-grandmother, Veronica, passed away in October of 1985. She was apparently particularly fond of the 12th of the month, as she was born on July 12th, married on June 12th, and passed away on October 12th. I remember my mother telling me that Veronica, Great-Grandma J, as I called her, was a deeply religious woman. A stroke ended her life, but it had not been her first. Nearing her final stroke that would take her life, she told my mother that my great-grandfather had visited her and told her it was time for her to join him. Not too long after, she did. While there is still so much more to learn, I'll wrap it up here. I hope you have been inspired to research or continue researching your own family lines and adding depth to your family history through these types of resources.